Dear learners, welcome to the MOOC on Economics of Gender and Development. In this video, we will discuss the module 5 of the course, which is Gender and Development. Dear learners, we all know that every individual is born with a body, and each body consists of certain set of reproductive organ. And on the basis of those organs, a society presents an individual with a social identity of being a girl or woman and boy or man. Along with this social identity, the society presents choices to an individual regarding their self expression as well as the roles and responsibilities that they are required to play later as a member of society. Often, this segregation does not take into consideration the innate abilities or the interests of the individuals, since the process of granting social identity takes place immediately after a child is born. This identity is referred to as gender, and it is a social construction whereby certain expectations are associated with that identity. However, scholars like Friedrich Engels have argued that if we carefully look at the history of most of the societies, we can see that women are often granted limited and inferior choices, which often do not allow them to exercise their innate abilities. Moreover, the recognition and the choices available to other genders, apart from those who identify themselves as men or women, is often negligible. But why is this important when we are discussing development? In this module, we will be discussing the connection of this social identity called gender with development. We all know that change is an inevitable fact. No society can remain static forever, but societies can plan a desired change which can lead to progress. Development is a type of change which is considered as desired, planned, and progressive. But how do we attain this change? Which aspects of a society needs the focus to attain that change? For that, we have to know what do we understand by development. Here, it is worth mentioning that what we understand as development has undergone changes over the years. During the 1950s, international organizations like the World Bank used gross national product per capita to divide the countries into development categories. Here, wealth was seen as a measure to represent development because it was assumed that with greater wealth comes other benefits like improved health, education, quality of life, etc. So there was a bifurcation in terms of wealth as global north and the global south, with the global north representing the developed countries and the global south representing the developing and the underdeveloped countries. During this phase, it was advocated that countries were required to follow this European model to develop themselves. During the 1960s, dependency theory gained more prominence. There was a recognition that the global south was poor because of the exploitation by the north. During this phase, most of the nations adopted a welfare approach whereby women were seen as passive and within the periphery of domestic roles. Therefore, projects addressed women's practical needs such as food, aid, health, and nutrition advice, etc. During the 1970s, amidst the other prevailing approaches, the basic needs approach gained more prominence. This approach advocated that the focus of the governments and the aid policies should be on providing for the basic need of the world's poor. There was also recognition of the fact that the developmental policies have differential impact on men and women. It was also identified that women comprised of one of the poorest section of the society. So, prompted by the UN decade, focus was on women's advancement in the public sphere. With those initiatives during this phase, the concept of women in development gained prominence. But it was during the 1980s when the focus was more towards the market. The governments began to retreat from the direct involvement in economic activities. However, this phase witnessed a shift from the concept of women in development to gender and development, about which we will be discussing in the subsequent sections. This was also the time when the concept of sustainable development gained popularity, and in 2015, the United Nations member states shared a blueprint for peace and prosperity for the people and the planet. This blueprint came to be known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In the agenda, 17 sustainable goals were recognized as the arenas that require urgent call for action by all the countries, whether it is developed or developing, and to form a global partnership. Among those SDGs, one is to achieve gender equality. However, according to the Sustainable Development Goal Report of 2025, progress is deeply inadequate and the world remains far off the track from achieving the targets by 2030. The report says gender equality remains elusive, hampered by discriminatory laws and gender based norms. It is in this context it is pertinent to revisit the connection between gender and development. Now let us discuss about the concept women in development. And to do so, we will refer to the report Mind the Gap authored by Nazneen Kanji. As mentioned earlier, the concept of women in development emerged in the early 1970s that was proposed by a collective of Washington based women professionals operating in the development sector. These pioneers argued that the existing modernization and accelerated growth models, which dominated development paradigms during the 1950s and 1960s, failed to ensure that women in global south received equal benefit. The central argument was that women has been systematically marginalized in conventional development initiatives with essential resources and skills disproportionately channeled towards women. The women in development movement received significant foundational influence from the then ongoing women's movement in the north, particularly the efforts of the western feminists advocated for equal rights, greater employment opportunities, and increased public participation for women. Concurrently with this advocacy, an important body of research focused on women in developing nations began to surface. Esther Bozarov's work, Women's Role in Economic Development, proved highly formative and is frequently regarded as the fundamental text for the UN Decade for Women. Bozarov's studies identified sub Saharan Africa as characterized by female farming systems, where women assumed substantial responsibilities for food production, often employing traditional hoe technology. Her critique targeted colonial and post colonial agricultural policies. She theorized that the productivity enhancing policy interventions and the influence of the Western ideas regarding appropriate female tasks inadvertently enabled men to monopolize the new technologies and the cash crops. This pattern effectively undermined women's established role in the sector of agriculture and created a rigid dichotomy between the modern cash crop sector and the subsistence sector. Consequently, women were relegated to the subsistence sphere. This had also resulted in a tangible loss of income, weakened status, and reduced power in relation to men. This ultimately rendered their agricultural contributions invisible. The women in development approach and the initial UN decade for women prioritized attention on women's productive labor and advocated for their integration into the economy as the primary means to enhance their status. This focus represented a direct intellectual rejection of the earlier policy frameworks, commonly known as the welfare approach. This approach had narrowly defined women almost exclusively by their roles as wives and mothers and restricted policy interventions to the social welfare areas such as home economy and nutritional education. Now, let us go to the next section, that is the theoretical roots of women in development approach. The theoretical foundation of women in development lies in liberal feminism, which fundamentally seeks to apply the liberal political principles of liberty, equality, and justice universally to both men and women. Liberal feminists argue that women's disadvantaged position originates from the stereotypical customary expectations that are projected by men and internalized by women. It is perpetuated through the process of socialization. According to this ideology, these disadvantages can be overthrown by implementing measures such as providing girls with improved training and better role models, introducing anti discrimination legislation, equal opportunity programs, and liberalizing labor markets. However, this approach exhibited minimal focus on men or on the examination of power relations operating between the genders. In other words, the advocates of the women in development approach did not critique the dominant modernization paradigm but were concerned by women's failure to benefit from it. Early responses, including the UN International Decade for Women, led to the establishment of policies and institutional mechanisms across numerous international development organizations and national governments. This era saw the proliferation of women's ministry and bureau in governments, along with women in development desks and focal points in international agencies. Additionally, in a context where there was a recognition of the failure of the trickle down economics and thereby a need to introduce explicit poverty reduction strategies, the anti poverty approach to boost women's productivity and participation in the development interventions emerged. In response to the Women in Development approach, demands for productive employment, increased support for small scale and income generating activities for women was seen. Despite these policy goals, the subsequent Women in Development projects were often undermined during the implementation. Interventions often focused on developing skills in areas like traditional handicrafts or nutrition and strategies to create women only projects, which generally proved ineffective in overcoming the structural economic marginalization faced by women. By the close of the 1970s, criticisms directed at the women in development model intensified. Feminist thinkers began to argue that women in development approach tended to isolate women as a separate and homogenized group. It remained vague and ambiguous in its analysis and identification of the causes of women's subordination. Another distinct wave of criticism originated from the feminists in the global south. These voices advocated for women's empowerment instead of mere integration into development processes. They contended that development processes were inherently flawed, being premised upon fundamental inequalities between the industrialized northern economies and the poor southern countries. This empowerment approach drew heavily on the influences from anti colonial movements and possessed theoretical roots in the dependency and neo Marxism. With regards to the empowerment approach, Nazneen Kanji has cited the example of two associations. First is the Dawn or the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. It is an international network of the Third World women researchers that became a prominent representative of this viewpoint. Dawn promoted collective action, advocating that women work together in autonomous organizations, either through self help initiatives addressing their own needs or within the broader anti imperialist coalitions. The other is SEWA, or the Self Employed Women's Association, that serves as a strong example of a successful grassroots organization maintaining a long term base while promoting women's interests nationally. Established in 1971 and registered as a trade union for informal sector women in 1972. Seva subsequently co founded the Seva Bank to provide poor, self employed women with access to credit and finance services, thereby reducing their reliance on exploitative moneylenders. Seva utilized their collective bargaining tools typical of trade union movements but adapted its strategy for areas lacking formal employment prospects by forming village organizations at the grassroots level. Seva assists women in managing their own organizations, forming cooperatives, and bargaining collectively in the marketplace. Crucially, Seva focused less on merely providing credit and more on empowering women to utilize their own resources effectively. Through its effort, women in Ahmedabad and Gujarat are assuming leadership roles and realizing the potential of collective bargaining power for better wages, working conditions, improved health and education, and combating domestic violence. Now let us discuss about the shift from women in development to gender in development. The limitations inherent in women in development approach led to the slow conceptual shift towards gender and development during the mid 1980s. Coined by Ruth Gaber in 1982, the gender and development as a term was adopted to shift the focus away from women and towards analyzing relationships, processes, and structures that generate women's disadvantage. This transition recognized that a singular focus on women was insufficient to fully grasp the problems they face, and that women are not a homogeneous group. They are divided into intersectional factors such as race, class, and ethnicity. It has been noted that the women in development era there were creation of narrowly based women's sector within the international agencies which lacked real political influence and was consequently underfunded and understaffed. This weakness was attributed to the flawed conceptualization of strategies and problems in terms of women rather than gender. This conceptual shift occurred against a backdrop of global economic change that was characterized by increasing southern indebtedness, economic deterioration in the north, and the subsequent rise of neoliberal economic reform promoted during the Reagan and Thatcher years. Structural adjustment programs or SAPs emphasizing market led growth, economic liberalization, and cuts in public spending were promoted as a solution to debt crisis in the South. Development agencies responded to this context by increasingly recognizing women's multiple societal roles. Women were viewed as adept managers capable of compensating for the declining household income and state services by combining different roles at home and work. This approach was termed as the efficiency approach. This approach sought to maximize development effectiveness and efficiency through women's contribution, dominating international agency strategies in the 1900s, in the 1990s. However, the efficiency approach faced intense criticism for effectively transferring social costs onto women. Research documented the negative societal effects of SAPs, arguing that the costs were shifted from the state onto the less powerful groups, including women. Feminist economists, notably Diane Elson, demonstrated that structural adjustment policies contain a profound male bias, particularly in the way economies are measured and conceptualized. It focused predominantly on the monetarized commodity economy while neglecting the care economy wherein women bear the predominant responsibility. A gendered economy approach recognizes that traditional economies offer only a partial analysis. It prioritizes the monetized it prioritized the monetarized productive economy over the non-monetarized reproductive economy. Reproductive activities are typically performed at the household level. It includes domestic work, the care of the sick and children, food preparation, and subsistence production. Economic analysis systematically overlooks this reproductive sphere. Crucially, both the productive and the reproductive economies are recognized as socially constructed and based on a gender division of labor, which traditionally assigns primacy to men in productive roles and to women in reproductive roles. Although powerful development agencies like the World Bank reacted to the research and advocacy by modifying approaches such as re emphasizing the state's enabling role and highlighting empowerment and institutions, many analysts maintain that these reforms do not fundamentally alter the neoliberal approach. This ongoing macro context profoundly influences the strategies used to mainstream gender within organizational settings. Dear learners, the move towards gender and development is underpinned by the interaction of multiple feminist schools of thought, explaining the varying interpretations of gender and diverse ways through which agencies attempt to mainstream the concept. These schools illustrate distinct conceptions of the human nature, sex and gender, and the desired structure of society. Now, let us try to know about them briefly. First of all, we have the liberal school of thought. It is based on the 18th and the 19th century political theory that viewed individuals as autonomous and rational beings. According to this thought, a good society ensures individual rights, liberty, and autonomy. Sex is recognized as biological and binary, and gender is viewed as a socialized behavior. Next, we have the radical school of thought. It originates in the late 1960s women's liberation movement. It views humans as embodied sexed beings. Sex class defines women as an oppressed class, and gender is seen as a social construction that ensures women's subordination. This school seeks a gender sex free society or potentially matriarchy. Next, we have the psychoanalytical school of thought. It is influenced from the Freudian theory. This school argues that human nature develops biologically and psychosexually. Gender as a social construction structures male domination, influencing psychosexual development. It aims for a society without gender structuring, achieved through shared parental upbringing. Then we have the Marxist school of thought. This school is influenced by Marxist analysis of society. It argues that human nature reflects material and historical conditions. They integrate gender as a result of historical class relations that constitute oppression with the emergence of the concept of private property. This school seeks a classless society enabling the full development of human nature. Then we have the socialist school of thought. This school emerged in the 1970s attempting to synthesize Marxist, radical, and the psychoanalytic feminisms. They view human nature as something that is created culturally and historically through dialectical interrelations of human biology, labor, and society. Gender is viewed as processual and socially constituted through the intersections of sex, race, class, ideology, and experiences of oppressions under both capitalism and patriarchy. It aims for the elimination of all the private public systems of oppression based on sex, gender, race, or class. Then we have the post structural or postmodern school of thought. This school is located in the contemporary French critiques of identity. It challenges the rational subject, viewing consciousness and subjectivity as discursive effects. Here, sex or gender are discursive practices that constitute subjectivity through power and resistance in the materiality of bodies. It aims for the ongoing deconstruction of social discourses and practices. Then we have the Third World or the post colonial school of thought. It emerged from the critiques of the Western feminisms and epistemologies. They view Western human nature constructs as achieving dominance by making the other invisible. It focuses on complex subjectivities beyond Western conceptions of sex and gender, examining gendered aspects of globalization. It considers the Western ideology of a good society as a product of colonial relationships, suggesting other social formations are possible. So, dear learners, the diversity of these intellectual roots explain the variation in how the term gender is interpreted by different actors and agencies. And these interpretations impact how gender is incorporated into the development practice. So, here we conclude this module on gender and development. I hope you have found it interesting. Thank you.